Hello and welcome, good friends and people, friends of good friends, to the last and final panel at A Weekend with Good Friends. With me tonight, I have again once more fantastic panel guests, and we will this time be talking about the overlap between horror and urban fantasy, of how to blend the supernatural and the mundane in a modern day setting, using magic, monsters, and mystery that coexist in everyday life. And I'd like to give a brief introduction, or let my panelists introduce themselves briefly. And I'm just going to go down the line, starting with Jason.
Oh, hi, I'm Jason Fryer, writer, game designer, and general curmudgeon. You can find me at OtterPoet on the interwebs. I've written for Cult Divinity Lost, Beyond Darkness and Madness, the GM's Manual, as well as Through the Breach, and several other games, a lot of them in kind of the urban fantasy setting. So,
Fantastic. Next in the line, Monte Lynn.
Hi, excuse me. I'm Monte Lynn. I'm a freelance tabletop RPG writer and editor. I've done editing work for companies like Magpie Games on their Avatar Legends role-playing game. I also have done editing work for Angry Hamster Press on their Witch Fated Souls 2nd Edition horror urban fantasy role-playing game. So that is probably perfect for this conversation. I'm also a short story speculative fiction writer. I have some stuff published online, and I'm also a managing editor of Uncanny Magazine, which is a science fiction fantasy magazine that comes out once every 2 months. And in fact, our next issue is coming up this Tuesday. Yeah, this Tuesday morning. So, and that's me.
Fantastic. Just going down the circle. Sue, how about you?
Hi, I'm Sue Savage. I'm a scenario writer. I've written several scenarios for the British urban fantasy game Liminal. You can find those on DriveThruRPG. I've also appeared on a few actual plays on Symphony Entertainment.
Fantastic. And then we have Richard Ruane.
Hi, I'm Richard. I am a game writer and publisher. I run Our Rook Studio, which has started in 2020. And I have published Barrakeep, Moonlight on Roseville Beach, a game I run all the time and suddenly can't think of the name of, and the upcoming Haunting of Cliff Cove.
Fantastic. And yeah, I'm David. I'm going to be the moderator today. When I'm not helping out here at Good Friends, you can find me at VastonCon, which will be in September, or you can find me at Illusion HorrorCon, which will be in December. If you don't know any of those two, then I urge you to look them up, illusionhorrorcon.events and the vastoncon.com. And with that, we switch a bit to urban fantasy and the lore thereabouts, with an easy question. What is your favorite urban fantasy media? It can be a system, it can be a film, it can be a book, whatever type. Just something easy to get us going. It can be also sparkling vampires.
No.
Sorry, we already have a line in Veil that we cannot do sparkling vampires. So
Yeah.
I apologize.
I can jump in.
Yeah,
I
please.
actually got introduced to urban fantasy through the World of Darkness. I feel like urban fantasy as a concept was not a known label. It was a known label, but it was not a super popular label in the early 90s. So World of Darkness sort of promoted itself as a game of games of personal horror where you're the monster. But really, it became a sense of exploration of so many things that we consider core to the urban fantasy thing of romance and relationship focused stories, faction wars, forging your own identity in the world in relation to groups that you were sort of forced into contact with and sort of given an identity in without really much of a choice. And I think that that was kind of my actual real first introduction to urban fantasy, long before I read any urban fantasy novels or saw any of sort of the tie-in movies.
Well, my introduction was Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
Mm-hmm.
So that showed up when I was just the right age for it. And that's where I first got this presentation of a world of monsters and magic that the majority of people are unaware of. And there's a few people in the know who have to deal with it.
Jason, Monte?
I think my introduction was kind of the unspoken father of urban fantasy, who I would say is Charles DeLint, a writer in Ottawa, Ontario. His Newford stories pretty much laid the groundwork for urban fantasy and my experience with it. And then, as Richard said, World of Darkness came along, and I was hooked. So.
What about you, Monte?
Well, everyone stole my answers, so I'm trying to think of some good other ones. Actually, you know what? The DC Comics, the Vertigo line back in the '90s. I can't remember if Hellblazer, the John Constantine comics, were in Vertigo, but definitely Sandman. Neil Gaiman's Sandman. Books of Magic, that kind of spin-off. So I think, yeah, actually, comics probably was my major introduction. Basically, being a lost, confused college student and wandering into a comic book store, and then somehow wandered over into the weird, modern fantasy, urban fantasy kind of section, and just spending way too much reading comic books and getting the employees pissed off because I was not buying anything.
Okay.
And at this point, I know that you are my people. This is wonderful.
Monty, I was definitely one of the people who caused comics to be wrapped in plastic later because I was, I had no budget in grad school, so I would just read the comics at the store like it was a library. Yeah.
Good. Which brings me actually to a first question. What makes a good urban fantasy stand out from all the others, and what elements can horror add to them?
I think it's the kind of the wainscoting concept that basically there's a world behind our world. These fantasy concepts are just basically living outside, our peripheral vision. There's a bunch of unseelie fae hanging out on the street corner, looking beautiful. It just that idea that there is another world that if we turn one wrong corner, we're in it.
Feel free to just jump in.
I feel like urban fantasy and horror might have a lot more overlap than not. Bringing back to the comics, right? Like Hellblazer and at least early Sandman, there were very strong horror themes in all of that fantasy. So I kind of almost don't see them that different. It's just like one little turn off kilter makes it horror. Just those beautiful fae and like hanging out in the alleyway while if you accidentally make a promise to them, it's like twisted to horror already. Especially if they're not exactly the nice fake, for example. So I don't know, that's the way I think of it.
And we've just been talking about classic monsters in a previous panel, and all of these classic monsters are absolute staples of most urban fantasy. Like, you're pretty much always going to get vampires, werewolves, fairies, and magicians.
So I think I think the wainscoting is really crucial there, and I think that's also sort of where the horror comes, the components of horror come in, but also the components of promise. Is that there's a sense of dissatisfaction with the everyday world among the protagonist, and then going past the everyday world into something larger, which is both dangerous and frightening, but also promising, is I think kind of one of the themes that sort of urban fantasy sort of explores pretty powerfully, is that when you open a door, metaphorically or literally, you are taking in all the parts of the world that you find there, whether the dangerous parts and the parts that are promising and fulfilling.
Okay. In your, before I actually come to the next question, based on your answers, I want to remind the audience, those with us live right now, not those in the future, unfortunately, but if you have any questions you want to ask our panelists to that topic, please send them along, and we'll try to get to them. As we said earlier, sparkling vampires are unfortunately excarded for this conversation, so please refrain from those. But I wanted to kind of follow up on this because during this many panels that we had here, we often had a focus on Call of Cthulhu, Cult Divinity Lost, or other systems with very specific horror, I would say, cosmic horror, sci-fi horror, modern horror. In your understanding, what do you think distinguishes the urban fantasy horror from these other systems? What is it that makes it unique?
I think it's tonal. I mean, as Monte was saying, horror and urban fantasy are pretty connected, but I think the way that a lot of people more understand urban fantasy is that fantastical experience rather than the horrific experience. I mean, they're non-exclusive, but I think the tone shift is where it's found. For example, in City of Mist, there's a lot of horror aspects just lurking beneath the surface, but the focus is how these characters and their reflections of what they represent, the ideas that they represent, affect the world, are more, fantastical in nature, more godly in nature, mythical. It's the magical realism, I think, that just seeps into urban fantasy.
I think it's quite common for the protagonists in urban fantasy to be more powerful than the ones in a straight-up horror. So most of the examples I'm thinking of, often the main character is a wizard. So people like John Constantine, but also Harry Dresden and Peter Grant in the Rivers of London series. Obviously, Buffy the Vampire Slayer has her own kind of power.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point.
I think when we were on an earlier panel about sort of non-Lovecraftian horror, I thought, I think one of the promising directions in cosmic horror was kind of provided by Clive Barker, because one of the thematic things that Barker explores is that you as the protagonist needs something from the dark, frightening, cosmic, incomprehensible supernatural world, and I think that's one of the things that sets kind of urban fantasy apart is there's something for you there, something that you can get, and I think Barker does some really, both his best and his worst, does some really cool stuff with how that world transforms you and sometimes doesn't really allow you to go back. And I'm certainly biased towards my favorite Barker, which is the movie Nightbreed, and Cabal, which it's based on. But I think that shows up in a lot of his fiction too.
I think I feel like in a lot of urban fantasy, there's very much a focus on the interpersonal relationships of the characters and how they intersect with aspects of fantasy, the fantastic elements. I'm trying to think of I was trying to think of a Neil Gaiman example, but a lot of Neil Gaiman's protagonists are just very most boring, mundane people, kind of caught up and very clueless about what's going on. So I don't know if that would work, but yeah, I think it's just. I'm gonna have to think about this one a little bit, so I'll pass it along to somebody else.
When I wrote in Beyond Darkness and Madness, tooting my own horn here, I did one of the sections was basically a reflection of urban fantasy in the Cult Divinity Lost mythos. And one of the agendas that I thought helped remove it from that horror, that Gnostic horror, was placing the characters at the conflict's heart. The characters have more agency. Normally, they're just basically being pulled forward towards some grisly end. But in urban fantasy, they could be surrounded by monsters, but they still have agency. They still have, as Sue said, they still have power, even if they don't, even they can't throw around, magic. They're still at an advantage, even as they're exploring this new world.
Because doesn't at least early urban fantasy, I felt like kind of pulled a lot from like detective noir genres, right? And like the detective might not be the smartest person, might not be the strongest person. In fact, in many cases, isn't, and the detective gets beat up constantly. A lot of the story is very much kind of on their like moral choices, their code, like the hard-boiled detective that just wants to get the job done because like if they don't, then they're nothing, because at least that is a standard they can like live by, is I'm going to solve this mystery even if it's going to get me in so much trouble. So I think that maybe that ties into what I was saying previously about the personal relationships, and like it's very kind of focused on the like moral choices, ethical choices that the characters have to make these kind of roles. So
yeah, I mean, and that's why to your question kind of about what's the difference between Call of Cthulhu and urban fantasy. Again, the players in Call of Cthulhu, they have very little agency. They're not going to affect these world-shattering events. They might scratch the surface. They might stop this one plot, but they're either going to be dead, insane, or they will have failed by the end of it. Whereas in urban fantasy, you go through the detective work. You solve the problem. You become part of that world, and you have your influence resonate beyond that moment. I liked one book was Roof World. It was kind of an urban fantasy where basically it's set on the rooftops of London with all these different conspiracies and factions fighting. The characters on the ground come up to Roof World and they shake things up. They change the status quo, and that the effects of their actions resonate beyond the novel itself.
Hedge, a viewer at the moment, hi Hedge, mentions also that Perry Pratchett's Nightwatch series is probably worth mentioning here, which I certainly agree. Not really horror, not even realistic, the way in which he grapples with the same themes. And yeah, I think it's certainly on kind of on par with this discussion as well. Sue, anything? Richard?
Just thinking that those Night Watch books are urban fantasy in a very literal sense.
That is true. From these, I mean, each of those and we mentioned a couple of those, have specific themes or motifs within the fantasy and the lore. Is there some that resonate the most with you? Is there some that you kind of feel like they've now been downwashed and excarded enough?
I guess I've kind of gotten tired of vampires in general. They used to be creatures of horror, and as we were discussing in the previous panel, it wasn't until Guillermo del Toro did the Strigoi that vampires became interesting to me again, because they were just these aloof people smoking and quoting poetry rather than exploring the horror of, I need to feed off of human beings. What does that mean?
I think one thing I've seen a lot of, and I would love to see less of, is really tight, strict taxonomies of like, this is a vampire. We know it's a vampire because these 5 things, and it has these rules. And then we know this is an undead lich because we know this is, and it, like, I would really love to see, and not like pulling new monsters out of the air with that also have strict taxonomies. I would like to see some taxonomies break down, and some of our notions of monstrosity and what and transformation sort of shift. So I feel like we just see so much. And big fan of World of Darkness, huge fan of Buffy, but I feel like we've seen a lot of those things where there's a book you can look at that's going to give you all the answers about what to do in situation X, and those rules are always accurate and always work, and the monster is never aware that you know the rules. Because what made Dracula so compelling, whether you're looking at no matter how you're looking at it, as a horror novel or as sort of a setup for sort of like a revival of the vampire literature, is that the rules work, but Dracula is just as aware of the rules as you are and knows exactly how to get around them. And the number of times that people do things to protect themselves that are supposed to work and technically do work, and Dracula knows how to get around those rules are really kind of powerful. So I'd really love to see sort of a more critical relationship with sort of the D&Dization of monsters, where we have strict taxonomies of how things sort of align, and we all know what they are.
One thing I'm absolutely not tired of, and I'm very happy to keep seeing more of, is basically paranormal detective agencies. That's my absolute favourite trope in urban fantasy. So the Dresden Files and Rivers of London are some of my favourites. The game Liminal that I mentioned, it's based on both of those two book series, so you're frequently playing paranormal detectives in that one, and most of the stuff I've written for it is their mysteries that people are calling in these paranormal detectives to solve.
Yeah.
I started reading that, and it's also a gorgeous book.
Monte, anything you want to add?
Not really. I'm always a little hesitant to say, like, I don't want to see any more X of this, because sometimes somebody will find a way to spin it in an interesting way. So like a lot of writing advice, like too many people will like say, "Oh, don't do this," and then it will suddenly remove every adverb on all existence, and I'm not a big fan of that kind of thing. So I think I just use a lot of words to say that I pass, I guess. So sorry.
No trouble. Sue, you mentioned you write a lot of liminal paranormal detectives. Jason, you wrote Beyond
Darkness
and Madness. That the way. Are there specific elements or experience that you want to share? Maybe that surprised you, that you had a lot of fun with when you incorporated these parts into your stories? What was something that you kind of like to utilize, research even a bit more, and how did that end up in your stories?
So one thing that took me by surprise when I started writing liminal scenarios is that I suddenly found myself wanting to write about vampires. I had become utterly bored with vampires as a subject, and then I picked this book up and it was like, oh, you made them scary again. And suddenly I was coming up with ideas for them.
Do you keep the classical motifs, or did you change anything from them? Is there anything particular about them now?
I'd say they're fairly classical vampires. I mean, you can't guarantee what their weaknesses are going to be. They are not all the same. Like, some of them are going to be scared of garlic, but not all of them. You cannot count on any specific thing working.
Mm-hmm.
So I like that it has the flexibility.
Richard?
I think I get hyper fixated on the amateur sleuth, and I think a thing could you repeat the question just to make sure I'm actually answering it? So
your experience in incorporating these elements into your own writings of urban fantasy.
Yeah. I think it's I get very fixated on the amateur sleuth in mind, and one thing I especially on touching on the amateur sleuth, the paranormal detective agency, something like that. One thing I love to pull over from hard-boiled fiction and from giallo and from other places where we see the amateur sleuth sort of pop up, even Scooby-Doo, is that a notion that frequently the driving notion of like how this bad thing happened is more convenient for making everyone feel safe and putting the case to bed than it is to actually explaining what happened. And that is a driving component of hard-boiled fiction. That's almost always how amateur investigators in a giallo or an Argento movie get involved, is because the police are just like, well, obviously X did it, and we're going to move on to other stuff. So it's sort of like the notion of sort of the first opponent you sort of have to deal with is the dominant theory of how the bad thing happened, whether that's denial of supernatural or just over convenient looking at circumstantial evidence and trying to get away from it. I think that's the part I sort of hint, like whenever I bring in an amateur investigation or amateur sleuth into a scenario, the unsatisfactory nature of how anyone else in the world is dealing with the situation is sort of dominant.
Well, I expanded my library while I was doing research for Gods and Monsters a little too much. So yeah, discovering a whole bunch of new urban fantasy was wonderful. Like Chuck Wendig's series, just absolutely love that. I guess it's exploring these concepts from a completely different angle and trying to incorporate more horror into it. The concepts of mythology and how it's reflected in today's society and how it can mirror different events and different concepts in our current society, and how that continues to resonate through us. And also that internal longing that we seem to all possess for that bit of mysticism, just to touch that bit of magic.
Monte, anything you want to add?
Sorry, what was the original question? I apologize.
Your
Sorry, what?
experiences in incorporating elements.
Oh wow. I'll say it's just kind of this like, okay. This is very tangential, but like doing research is always kind of fascinating how weird our actual world is, right? Like, this is not a story I wrote or a game I developed, but I was in a Noblest game with a friend, and I went down a rabbit hole and ended up learning about. I had to look him up. Tony Gaudi, the architect of the incomplete cathedral in Barcelona, right? And he's such a weird and fascinating like figure, and the fact that like I think there are plans to finish it, and I think it will be finished in a few years. I heard, but the fact that there is this like there was for this longest time this incomplete like cathedral, and part of the magic is the fact that it was incomplete. And that like I don't know. I think what I find funny about like urban fantasy is that sometimes there's actually really interesting and weird stories in just our own history, like and so I think my answer is that like every time I try to do some research to do an urban fantasy story, I end up just falling it down into just actual history. So I don't know.
Okay.
That's part of the fun, right? Is to
Yeah.
like learn stuff about your actual world while trying to figure out a fantasy one.
Well, yeah, I mean that's the core of urban fantasy right there, is the city. Just exploring the history, the hidden history of these different cities has nothing to do with myth. Doesn't even need it. I mean, some of these stories are so fantastical you wouldn't believe it to begin with. So yeah, I just love learning about new metropolises and different cities and the people they're there and their history.
I think that's one of the ways that I kind of circle back to an older question, that I think urban fantasy frequently differs from at least the way a lot of people play Call of Cthulhu, or it's one of those frustrations of naming that there is a U.S. system called liminal horror and a British system called liminal. So here I'm just going to talk about liminal horror. That we frequently play our supernatural investigators or run campaigns of our supernatural investigators as globetrotters who are going to die quickly. And when we get to a city or a setting, it frequently feels like we're on a 2-day tour. Like we've just gotten to Rome, and there's the 5 different monuments you need to see in Rome, and let's get back on the bus.
All of Cthulhu, the layover.
Yeah. And I know a lot of people play Call of Cthulhu. An increasing number of people play Call of Cthulhu very differently. But I feel like urban fantasy for me was an opening into like, no, this campaign is in New Orleans, and we're gonna dig. Even if you've never been to New Orleans, you're gonna learn a whole lot about New Orleans. It's a chance to you as the GM reacquaint yourself with a place you've never encountered before, and to kind of bring in information. Because frequently those real details about a place that you look up will frequently make the world fresh in a way that you've just never experienced before. And sort of situate yourself in a place. And I think that's also where you begin to see the diversity of cities that in the 2-day tour, you're not going to see gay Rome. You're not going to see all the different ethnic populations living in Rome, or the ethnic populations living in New York, or and you're not going to see all the marginalized communities there, or all the different things that people who are local to that place know very well. But when you do an urban fantasy campaign and you're situated in a really a specific location, that just opens up the fictional world in new ways. So even Sunnydale, we know way more about Sunnydale than we do about a lot of places that I've played, like like the layover style investigative horror campaign.
Because the city basically ends up becoming its own character.
Yeah,
a very important character. And
exactly.
I'm actually I just suddenly realized that Magpie Games has Urban Shadows, which is basically kind of their love letter to the World of Darkness. And the second edition is supposed to be coming out pretty soon. But there's actually a whole chapter about defining your city, because your characters are not just anchored in the city, but they have to be attached to it in some way. They have to care about it, because what's going to happen is the things they do in the role-playing game is to change the city, and you're hoping, of course, to change it for the better. But this is an urban fantasy kind of horror game, so it's just going to create more complications that you have to deal with. But definitely constantly adding new things to the city, constantly defining it, making it basically a character. So
I think that ties back well to the hard-boiled detective fiction, where the hard-boiled detective is frequently hyper focused on cases in that one geographic area.
Sue, anything?
The liminal work that I'm currently doing it's going to be a setting guide and campaign in my own town, and it's just been a fascinating process digging into the history of my town, because where I live is not considered an interesting place in any way. It's a thoroughly unimportant town in the Midlands, famous for very little beyond a couple of famous people who come from here. But when you start digging into the history, you discover it was the capital of England for 200 years. And so if you've got vampires who are very stuck in the past, then they're going to see this place as important because it was when they were alive.
I guess I want to circle back a bit to a question from earlier. Another distinction, maybe, could you say that a distinction to urban fantasy is that, compared to Call of Cthulhu, that you not really want these one-shots, but you want rather like campaign play, you want longer plays where you can develop the X character, the nth character, which is the city, which is kind of the surrounding around you. Is that a statement you would support? Yes, no?
Well, yeah, I mean, urban fantasy, one of the cores is relationships to other characters, relationships to the city, and how those change the narrative. So the longer you're interacting with it, the more intimate the story becomes. Whereas with Call of Cthulhu, as Richard was saying, you're just kind of like moving around the map. I need to go to this clue and find this. Well, what's your relationship with that space? Oh, I don't need it. I have the clue. I can move on. With urban fantasy, you have a relationship with that bar or that coffee shop. You have a relationship with the person behind the bar or behind the desk.
And so those relationships with the landscape can be quite literal, and particularly in things like Liminal or Rivers of London, you've got the actual rivers as characters.
Yeah, again, the Urban Shadows game, one of the main literal currencies is debt. And I don't mean like monetary debt, is a favor that you owe another character, an NPC, or even a PC, but also a favor they owe you. So there's mechanics that are all about like, well, I'm gonna talk to this vampire lord, and he owes me something because I saved him in this one instance a few sessions ago. I'm gonna spend my debt to get like help me with this werewolf problem. And so the game is very focused on generating and then using that debt to keep the story going. It's very much a horrible detective who like knows Jimmy at the bar, who just happens to owe him a favor so he can get the information he needs to keep the story going. So yeah,
one of the coolest moves. Yeah, now just to follow up on what you were saying, Monte, is one of the coolest moves in Urban Shadows is the hit the streets move, where you just turn up to a place that members of a faction hang out, and you go like, "Hey guys, let's see if you can help me." So you show up at a bar, a coffee shop, a place where you could just theoretically walk in and start talking to people. And that sort of fleshes out the city sort of just as a move without having so much work put on the GM to look. Here's my massive map.
Okay. I think what I want to lead, because I also need to watch the time a bit, lead into the kind of the next aspect, which is the blending of the supernatural and the mundane. Meaning, when it comes to integrating these elements of supernatural, can you, from your own experience, maybe point out a couple of significant challenges or hurdles that you kind of faced when it came to these elements, or when it came to the problem of placing these elements into a modern setting, a more urban environment, and maybe how did you circumvent them and how did you overcome them?
I think I have something. If anybody minds, I lead off, or somebody else. Okay. This is also tooting my own horn. I think I got that right. I wrote an essay on Strange Horizon, the magazine Strange Horizons. It's oh man, what's the title? I had a ridiculously long title. Where will you place us when we are dead? Okay. So the basic premise. This is mostly about afterlives, but I suddenly realized as I was researching it, this actually kind of about like the mythologies that you're creating in your storytelling. And and this is something I was struggling with because I never really thought about it until I started doing so. The idea of like the fun of the urban fantasy kind of story is that like in multiple cultures, multiple mythologies, it's kind of like in a city. The cities are kind of like a lot of people consider them the blending, the melting pot. But like there was an issue that I found out that I noticed in some other stories and that I was accidentally replicating was how to put it. I'm gonna have to use my own like personal experience. Like I'm second generation Taiwanese American. Like, my parents were immigrants, right? There's a lot of the mythology that my parents grew up in with that I'm just not familiar with because they kind of didn't really pass it along. Maybe I'm definitely more familiar with like American mythology, right? So like how if I wrote myself in an urban fantasy story, like do I intersect with like Chinese mythology? Does like the Chinese gods come and talk to me? Like if I say no, that sounds like this is really weird, right? Like I don't have you know uh, any cultural connection to that, right? But if I say yes, like okay, of course, being Chinese, then I will automatically get a connection with Chinese gods. I just create this weird, like almost like separation, like all Chinese people have their own mythology and they're separated from everybody else, even though they're living like in America, right? And there's this kind of like, you kind of be careful not to accidentally do um, this thing I call the Chinatown episode of a cop show, where oh, there's like an Asian person who's either like a victim or a murderer. You know what? We're gonna go to Chinatown because that's where all the Chinese people seem to be living for some reason, even though the fact that we're everywhere, we're all over the place, right? And there's even Lucifer, even the television show Lucifer had a Chinatown episode. I'm just like, like they're your dentist, around the corner might be Chinese. Like, I don't know why you have to go specifically to one location. And I think like mythologies might have a tendency to do that. Like there might be this worry, like to let's keep it separate that makes it safe, but then you're unintentionally separating, literally separating people. Like you're kind of saying you're not allowed to mix and match. Like I would be like very worried if you're trying to write a mixed character. If somebody is like black and Chinese, then like, oh, do you belong to one or another? And that's a very dangerous thing to kind of like assume in your mythology. So I can't say that I've answered this question. I something I struggle with, and it's probably something that I have to do like story by story. But it is definitely something like you kind of have to sit down and think about it and make sure you understand the implications if you make one decision or another. So very vague answer to a very complicated problem, but
No, good.
That's perfect.
Yeah, I never thought about that either. So, Sue, do you want to follow up?
The biggest hurdle I face is I sometimes get a bit too hung up on the history. And I have to remind myself that I'm writing fiction here and I can make stuff up. There's a lot of different types of fae in the UK, and maybe the fact that I don't have any specific stories about one particular type of fae in my own town doesn't mean I can't use them here.
That's certainly valid. Yeah. Richard, Jason?
I think one thing I hit is something we talked about in one of the previous panels I was on, I think was touched on in the Classic Monsters panel as I was listening to, is that we sometimes forget that in sort of like summoning forth the monstrous, that frequently humans are behind the summoning forth of the monstrous. We in the Classic Monsters panel, they talked about like humans do all these terrible things that we assign to monsters, and it immediately made me think that in the novel Dracula kills 4 or 5 people, maybe more, but Vlad Tepes, the historical figure, killed way more than 4 or 5 people, and not just killed, tortured to death, like way more than 4 or 5 people. So I sometimes get hung up on like, where is the monster? And I'm trying to make myself pull back and think like, who got the monster here? Like, why is the monster here? Why is this? It's not just vampire walked into town. Is rarely the answer that I find particularly interesting. It's like, who called down this curse, and who benefits from the monster being here and is trying to keep the monster here, even if they didn't summon it in some sort of official capacity. Who benefits from the monstrosity that's going on?
I think the one thing that I struggle with, and I've seen a lot of people struggle with, it kind of playing off of Monte, is the cultural appropriation. I mean, there's all these wonderful mythologies to explore, but one, does it have an actual purpose or place in your story? For example, the monster of the week trope falls into this a lot. Why is there a were hyena in downtown New York? Sure, it's a wonderful monster, but why is it there? And by just dropping it in there, are you actually giving it credit? Are you doing the culture credit? Or are you just basically going, it's something cool? And I noticed that a lot with some of the World of Darkness and similar genre, similar games, is that they just basically, it was like Monster of the Week, which is going to take this and not even actually look at what is behind that monster, what is behind that name. We've cleaned that up quite a bit in recent history, but for a person that is absolutely fascinated with Eastern horror, I have to be very, very careful. Am I getting this right? Am I doing this justice? Because ghosts by themselves have completely different meanings between Eastern philosophy and Western philosophy. So when you're creating, and also North America, we have so many layers of myth. I mean, you have the Native American myths, you have all of these immigrants dropping their myths, Irish, Scottish, English, German. It is a melting pot. So you've got to be able to not only build the layers, you've got to make sure that each layer is, appropriate and, you've done it justice.
That actually just made me think of, I don't know if that has a lot to do with it, but Neil Gaiman's American Gods. Because I was just thinking about this and the portrayal of these gods in a modern day setting, their struggle to kind of be recognized, to survive. I don't want to give a clear answer to or like interpretation of if it's good or bad, badly written, but it's certainly a good, I think, interpretation of incorporating these different elements, at least tastefully, as far as I can say. It was a fantastic book and a fantastic novel for me. I really enjoyed it, and it brought these kind of different elements, especially since I love Western and Nordic horror, Nordic lore. A very interesting aspect of how to incorporate these traditions into their settings and how these figures or characters then struggle with their own identity as well. I'm just wanted to maybe bring that in. I don't know if that is contributing to either answer, but that just made me think of this.
I do have to say that the essay that I wrote that I mentioned earlier does complain a little bit about American Gods, specifically the television show. I mean, I've read the novel like ages ago, but this was mostly about like media, visual media.
Yeah.
So there's a bit that I found kind of fascinating because it brought up a lot of questions of what I was talking about before. There's one of the episodes, a Muslim woman dies in a New York apartment, and Ra appears, and she asks all these questions of like, well, I'm Muslim, like why would Ra appear? And he kind of explains that it's like because her mother told her stories about like Egyptian mythology, and that's the reason why he appears. And but I was sitting there going like, so does that kind of invalidate her belief? Like, she has this strong religious belief, and now it's kind of been rudely erased. And the show kind of sidesteps it a little bit. I think there's a line where he says that like because of this favor, he came in as more of that was a psychopomp, like more of an intermediary. So it was their attempt to like not validate her belief system. But I don't know, it just asked a lot of like weird questions for me. And also she lives in New York, so it's like, is there an American like mythology that's supposed to intersect here, especially since this is literally her being taken to the afterlife? So that was one of the things that actually started like having me ask all these very complicated questions that I absolutely have no answer to. So I just wanted to point out that I do complain a little bit about American Gods.
Oh, good. I mean, yeah. Anything else on that question, or otherwise I would go to the next one, which would be about balance. We talked about challenges. Now I want to talk about balances when it comes to the blending of these two, of the horror and urban fantasy. How can one ensure that these supernatural elements will enhance the aspects of the story rather than to overshadow them? So when is too much too much? When is a sparkling vampire too much sparkle? Right, I guess is my question.
I guess it depends on the story you're trying to tell. Are the supernatural aspects, your core focus? Are you? Which are you having? More fantasy or more reality? Because with magical realism, the moment you get rid of the realism, the magic, it's just basically a fantasy story. So why have it set in New York? You could just put it in a completely third different world. So yeah, you look at what the supernatural actually will contribute to the story itself. What themes can that enhance? Just like in horror, what does the monster bring to the table? Why are they there?
I'm kind of exploring as I go on this one, and look back at the question so I don't wander off too much. And I think to pick up on something Jason said, I think it's sort of thematically, especially in a game, it's thematically where you as player and GM want to go. Because I think it's somewhat driven by thematically, how much protection do you want to give the everyday world in this narrative? Rodolfo Anaya, powerful magical realism, and was for a long time. I think he's been largely forgotten, but in the 80s and 90s, he became a big part of a lot of school curricula. But in university curricula, it was he frequently begins people outside the supernatural world, takes them into a magical realism scenario in which specifically in New Mexico, almost always in New Mexico, and then kind of pulls them out of that and sends them back to the everyday world. But then Clive Barker, who I also love, frequently drags people, sometimes kicking and screaming, into the supernatural world, gives them a lot of things, including really powerful personal transformations, and then leaves flaming gaps in the everyday world, because they can never really go back to the everyday world after experiencing the supernatural world, and they can only kind of touch the everyday world occasionally after that, because they're going to the transformations they've gone through are going to damage it, or get them labeled as monsters, or depending on the novel, it will shift. But at the end of Cabal / Nightbreed, the protagonist cannot go back to the everyday world and the everyday life. He's technically dead. He's actually dead, and radically transformed, can't be seen in the form he's in. So I think it's kind of thematically what do you want to explore? Are you trying to pull things back to a certain degree of normality and stability again? Or are you willing to just leave those sort of big burning gaps in reality and take people out of it and never really let them go back?
Sure.
I think the fact that I'm mostly writing mysteries for paranormal detectives actually makes it a lot easier to find that right balance, because generally you're starting off with some kind of crime, so it's going to be a theft, a murder, an abduction. You've got ordinary people involved. They're the ones who are seeking out help. So you're always going to have the balance between the supernatural that's in some way responsible for events and the entirely mundane world of someone who's just lost a family member.
One thing I do get tired of in urban fantasy, and I think people should kind of avoid it, is that the supernatural explains everything. That there's always some supernatural force pulling the strings and makes people do this or that, or this event happened because such and such a monster happened to be there. I think that takes away from from reality, and actually it takes away from the horror, because people can get along just fine without werewolves. They can do as much damage to the planet as they want.
I think at least with role playing games, I feel like constantly anchoring things in the quote unquote mundane world um, is kind of key. Making sure your player characters have like mundane connections, friends and family, and that may or may not be affected or threatened or maybe benefited by the supernatural world, but it's always back to the relationships with those characters. Even like when I'm writing up like scenarios and stuff, I try to make the antagonist like actually it's a mundane source, that is it's someone's loss that causes a spirit to come to then amplify that grief, and the supernatural aspect is affecting the world, but it's actually a very personal human grief that for example, that is actually the cause, and so that way it keeps everything focused on the I don't want to say small, I mean, because that denigrates like human experience. I think it keeps everything focused on the human experience as opposed to big fantasy stuff. So.
One mechanic that I really like is in City of Mist, the mythos and logos, where the character is literally balancing between their human life and the magical life. And depending on which way they go, they can either just become mundane again, or they can be completely consumed by the mythos that they represent. And I really like that balance. Just, as Monte said, having those connections to reality.
Anything else to that? Because I think we talked about this already a bit, but maybe you have some more ideas now about the kind of coexistence when you have the mundane and the supernatural when it comes to complex themes, as we explored a bit earlier about identity, but also power dynamics, societal norms, maybe gender inequality or minority representation. Do you have some ideas, suggestions maybe that you want to kind of give out that you've surpassed and already stumbled across in your past, but now want to give others the chance to not have to go through the kind of difficulties of it anymore?
I think in a different panel, I talked about the fact that, and this is coming from sort of the game publisher perspective. I think we talked about I don't think we've ever had such a diverse global community of TTRPG creators, and the technologies with which to pay them. Which I think I forgot to mention that as much as we may hate things like Stripe and PayPal, they enable us to pay people rather seamlessly who do not live in the same country with us. And there are legalities you need to be paying attention to there, but like it's no longer like, oh, this is a 6 weeks accounting nightmare to try to figure out how do I get you money. But we've never had such an incredible group of global writers who are easy to contact and much easier to find than they've ever been before, and they're in contact with Anglosphere communities, and sort of being very public about the fact that they're looking for work, and very skilled writers. And as we're looking for better ways to represent global cities and global communities and global mythologies, bringing them on board to your projects, especially if it's a project you're getting paid for and are paying other people for, is looking for ways to engage with those writers and artists who know those cities and those mythologies far better than we will from a Wikipedia article or even from an extensive collection of research, because they live in them and they live with them. So it's engaging those artists and writers.
Anything else? No. Okay. Then I think I want to.
Yeah, he answered it.
I think so too. Because I do want to kind of get maybe to what I've remember from the previous or the discussion that we had before, to the genres and sub-genres of these urban fantasies. And I want to start with the general tropes. If you can share specific insights of when you integrated kind of these classic urban fantasy tropes into your scenarios, your campaigns, and how did they overall contribute to atmosphere and the narrative that you wanted to create? Obviously, that is strongly dependent on system and so forth. But if you can elaborate on an example and why you liked your creation, especially. Sue, what about you?
I'm going to move slightly away from the liminal talk here and talk about cult. Yeah, because the campaign that I ran, the primary forces behind the whole campaign was community versus fear. And while doing a bit of research on the city in question, I discovered some news stories about how there'd been some guy going around biting people, and which immediately gave me the idea to incorporate a vampire into the plot. And so they're not hugely common in cults, but there's stuff in the book on how to do them, so I thought, why not? And so I decided to make this vampire part of this element of fear. He's basically an acolyte of the entity that's driving everything. And he's driven not quite so much by hunger for blood as the desire to frighten the people that he's attacking.
I think when we started the subgenre conversation, I talked a little bit about paranormal romance, and I think the side relationships, or one of the great places that tension comes, that JR was talking about between the supernatural and the mundane, comes into even non-supernatural detective fiction, is the relationship within the job life and the personal life. Which in American hardboiled fiction, almost always the job life ends up, you just become a detective. You just become an increasingly bitter detective. But in Roseville Beach, I really wanted to make sure I was not making an amateur sleuths protecting the town game about a queer town in which no one actually got to have a queer relationship, and I never really talked about that. So I wanted to make sure I added in some romance rules, and I think one of the things I sort of learned from paranormal romance that I wanted to bring in to that is it's never the chance somebody you're talking to won't be attracted to you. Like romance novels and romance B plots are frequently driven by mutual attraction from the get-go. It's never like roll to seduce or roll for like, do they like you? What you're really looking for is like, what is the bullshit that stops you from getting together? Is it the fact that you're caught up in these amateur investigations? You're the amateur sleuth sort of protecting the town, and you have this other life as a hero? Is it they have some complications in their life? It's the interesting thing is never the role to seduce thing. It's always like, how does your role in their reality kind of keep you from sort of getting together in a meaningful way?
Which again focuses on the relationship aspect of you want to establish relationship connection between characters, NPCs.
Yeah, I wanted to sync up with that comment that Richard made, but also to hype one of the many companies I work for. This is the Witch Fated Souls role-playing game, right? So basic premise is that your characters have basically sold their soul to a demon to get magical power. Now you're trying to figure out what to do about it. Like, do you try to get out of it? Do you try to make the most of what you can? Try to do as much good as you possible before the inevitable horrible thing happens. But there's a quick start up. You can run a like one-shot scenario. I've run it several times. And one of the very first things right in the middle of character creation is a list of questions to define an NPC that your group are friends with. And it's a bunch of leading questions, right? Like one of my favorite leading questions is, well, how did you fail this person? You know, and everyone always adds some weird magical thing they did that caused some bad thing to happen, right? To this person, and then now they feel guilty, you know. And this NPC is just this total cinnamon roll, right? He's this young guy who had to drop out of school because he's working 2-3 jobs in order to support his disabled mother and like siblings. And the hopefully it's not too much spoilers. Hopefully this is for GMs who are interested, but you know, a demon is now very interested in this cinnamon roll's soul, and so now you are brought in. Now you're invested. Try to figure out how to way to get this person out of this mess, you know. And I found out that these leading questions were very effective because now they have this character they want to protect. The other thing that I found really interesting in Witch Fated Souls is that because everybody has a demon, a different demon that they've sold their souls to, now the GM has kind of permission to be kind of like a jerk, right? To sit there and go like, oh, hey, I'm not causing problems for you. It's your demon. But running the one shot, I found out the most effective thing is to do nothing and just hint that I could do something, right? So like there's this one point where they suddenly realized that there might be competing forces over this poor cinnamon roll's soul, right? And I had one of the character's demons go, well, you know, if you took this deal instead, that's actually quite better, you know, because I could help and provide after they lost their soul. And like had players sit there go like, oh my, maybe that's a good idea. Maybe I should sell my soul to that guy's soul to my demon instead. Then like halfway through, they're like, what am I talking about? I'm actually trying to like ruin this guy's life. And it's just kind of, and I didn't actually in the game do anything. I didn't have, you know, the demon appear and like take the guy away. Instead, I just literally just said, well, what if you tried to do this? You know, just asking questions, you know, that kind of thing. And I forgot the question that I was trying to answer now all of a sudden. But another, so basically the stakes are very personal. You know, it's not world destroying stakes. It's literally just one person. Then the in a weird way, the characters have a lot of power. They have a lot of magical ability. One group decided to trick the devil, which I thought was totally awesome. And I literally said, well, the devil's going to find out and they're going to be really pissed. And they're like, oh, it's a problem for another session. We're only worried about this one right now, right? But I guess the horror is like just me just using words to sit there and try to tempt them one way or another, or to confuse them one way or another. You know, and literally there was one group that was all sat down. All four of them sat down. Their heads were in their hands. They're going, you don't know what to do. Everything seems just a bad choice. And I'm like, all right, welcome to Witch Fated Souls. You've seen the core theme. You just have to pick which bad choice you want to do. So it's not too hard to tweak that dial. Like I said, to turn the angle just 15 degrees and suddenly it's horror. Right? And it's not too hard just to tweak it out tiny to keep everything focused on like very mundane, but I think still important, like personal relationships, personal ethics, you know, the one choice that could help or hurt somebody, a single person's life. So part of that was just the spiel to talk about the game I worked on that I want people to check out.
Yeah, just playing off of that, it's not just the relationships between the characters that you can draw upon. I like we were previously mentioning the city. There's relationships with the cities, and then there's a relationship with place, and I call it, you know, city as character, place as person. And I did that with The Last Midnight, set in Hong Kong just before the you know, the British rule ended. There is a hotel on in Hong Kong that is, you know, where all the British nobles and diplomats would hang out, and I tweaked it so that literally their essence had bled into the building, So it literally became a sentient thing trying to uphold, its beliefs. And I dropped the players into that on the last night. So they were not only being played by, different different NPCs that were trying to hold on to their resources. The building itself was constantly needling them, do this, do that. And I just like that the concept that with urban fantasies that you can just do that these places have an essence and their own agency.
That reminds me also, Sue ran almost years ago now the cult version of Scott Dorwood's Unland for us, and that was terrifying, beautifully said, and yeah. But Sue, anything you want to mention?
Well, thank you springs to mind. Yeah, I think Scott just did an amazing job giving us that really evocative setting. Yeah, pretty much anyone can picture an abandoned theme park. The one thing I did learn is that fairground rides have different names in different countries. So if you are going to run that scenario, look up all the rides first.
Yeah. Anything else for the tropes or specific tropes that you might look forward to integrate, or that you want to maybe explore more in the future?
Not for me at the moment.
Okay. No, that's fine. Because the next question is more directed to the young adult urban fantasy, which is, I think, a bit of a different category, because, or I'm just going to ask that to you. What do you think are the challenges that you might encounter when you run YA-oriented urban fantasy games? And how do you kind of address those in the scenarios?
I think one of the things that's really interesting to me in YA urban fantasy is how it sort of riffs on it frequently ends up riffing on the faction war or faction rivalry concept to try to negotiate, to fundamentally be about forming personal identity, which I think can be really powerful, especially in World of Darkness and Urban Shadows, where I've seen people bring in characters who are neophytes to the world, to the supernatural world, and that sort of plays out for them in really powerful ways, because they're trying to figure out who they are while trying to figure out sort of well, but why do we hate the vampires? My friend the vampire is really neat. Why do we hate the witches? My friend the witch is really cool. I'm in love with a werewolf. Why are we so mad at the werewolves all the time? And that can be over humanizing for the monsters at times, but it's also I think it's can be also really, really a powerful. Monster Hearts does this beautifully. Specifically, that the faction wars, the faction rivalries, the kind of the shadow wars going on in the adult world, actively causing identity crises for teenagers specifically. And teenagers are already prone to identity crises. Adolescence is already a time you're figuring out your identity, and suddenly you have all these politics going on external to you that are trying to form you. That, I think, grows a lot nicely with World of Darkness, where you're almost always a neophyte who finds themselves as part of a faction who chose you, who you may not have actively chosen, or that you were born. In the case of werewolf, you were born into this werewolf clan or werewolf tribe. You didn't actively choose it. You were chosen by a vampire to join their clan. You didn't actively decide to become a vampire for the most part. You sort of awakened as a mage, and these were the people who brought you in and told you what was going on. And so you didn't actually decide to be part of a faction war or a faction. You just kind of found yourself there, and suddenly you've got to form this identity for yourself amidst all these sort of bigger politics going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Richard said it quite eloquently that I really like that aspect that adolescents are transforming and adding that extra layer of am I a teenage werewolf? Am I a teenage vampire? Am I a teenage, magic user? You're not only dealing with, maturing, you're basically been given these godlike powers. Your world has now been stripped away. You're seeing it from a completely different perspective, but you still have that underlying conflict with your elders. Your elders are telling you this is the way you have to do it. So there becomes that rebellion of bashing heads between the young and the old, the new and the established.
I think also when you've got adults with a lot of influence over you, then there's going to be the issue that some of them just don't know about the supernatural, and often you're having to not tell them in order to keep them safe from it.
Mm-hmm.
That's just going to further complicate your life. So one series that doesn't do that at all is the Lockwood and Co. There was a recent Netflix adaptation of the first two books, but that's been cancelled. So I'd recommend getting the books instead because they actually finish the story. Yeah, that's a setting where basically Britain has been overrun by ghosts and only children are psychic enough to see them, and therefore ghost hunting agencies are entirely staffed by children, but they're being run by adults. And so our lead characters are constantly having to deal with the fact that there's the governing body trying to tell them what to do. There's the big agencies who think they know better and are also trying to tell them what to do.
Isn't that the fact in general, that somebody above you tells you what to do, no matter what age or system?
So true.
I think it's also that investigative concept of like, oh, the dominant theory is not actually a useful explanation. That doesn't actually suit all the facts. It's convenient and allows us to stop doing work and stop worrying about things. Really comes, which is so powerful in detective fiction, and that urban fantasy borrows from sort of detective fiction. Becomes really powerful in a YA hands, because it's like, oh no, nothing you're telling me about the world is terribly satisfactory. It doesn't explain my experience, and I'm going to be really dramatic about it because I'm a teenager. So I feel like that's another. I keep seeing more that YA fantasy kind of picks up, or YA urban fantasy picks up on threads that are already in sort of the influences of urban fantasy, and really sort of tugs on them really super hard. The relationship components, the paranormal romance component, the investigative dissatisfaction with the official explanation, and then factionalism.
I think also YA fiction also really, really works well with the concept of like agency of the protagonist, right? Like in a lot of detective fiction, the detective has like agency in the beginning, but it's like they're very reactive, right? Like that's kind of the standard story structure. You start off kind of reactive, trying to figure out what's going on. Then at the end, you're starting to make decisions, like actual decisions to hopefully is in line with your values, or maybe not if it's more tragic, kind of thing. So that kind of fits really well with the whole idea of like YA protagonists like trying to understand their agency and figure out like what can we do, what can we change. Actually, I did a little research on this. I've been doing a little research on this. There's actually a strong contingent of YA horror, which I found kind of interesting, especially since, at least in the United States, there's been this attempt to sanitize YA. So all of a sudden, like there's another subset of writers that are kind of going against that by using horror tropes. I have a few like favorites if recommendations are okay here.
Yeah, certainly.
There's a trilogy. It's not finished yet. The first two books are out. It's called Escape Gracers by what's her name? H.A. Clark. It's basically about a group of teenage girls who form a cabal of witches. Right? And it's a really good series. It's very raw. You've got like really four strong personalities, both clashing, but also very strong found family, very queer found family messaging. So it's like they're constantly clashing, but then like fighting really hard to like make to make these relationships work. It's got, and of course, you've got demons and spellcasting and soul stealing and stuff like that. There's another one. It's a single book, Sawkill Girls by Claire Legrand. That one's a little more like as folk horror. There is basically a ancient eldritch being on an island community that is slowly eating a kid every few years, kind of thing. And then some adults are kind of complicit in this kind of thing. And there are basically a trio of teenage girls who are trying to figure out like what is going on and how to like untangle this mess. And those two are I think it would be strong recommendations for like YA horror to like mine for ideas and stuff. So
Anything else? No. Then I would maybe in the last quarter that we have left here, go a bit more maybe of the mechanics and the style of storytelling, which might be a bit different when it comes to urban fantasy, as well as or compared to the classical horror game systems. We had a panel about game mechanics earlier that was an inspiring talk about all kinds of systems, but specifically when it comes to urban fantasy, are there maybe game mechanics that you specifically like? Maybe why and how they are important, you think, for urban fantasy?
I'll jump in because I just had this thought during another conversation. I was waiting for the mechanics section, really. Is I feel like things like PBTA and things that sort of are less focused on giving numerical values to power, to specific powers, can be really compelling in urban fantasy because it stops the like, what can Batman defeat Superman sort of thing that ends up anytime you end up with a point buy system, or even as much as I love World of Darkness, could even like can a mage turn a vampire into a lawn chair type question, and starts focusing on like, what are you bringing to this narrative now? Like Buffy is a big influence on me, and like Buffy would have been a pretty boring show if Willow and Xander had not frequently found important things to do, important things to do. And I think PBTA opens that up. Forged in the Dark opens that up sometimes. Other Kind Dice, which is a slightly more obscure system, opens that up sometimes in ways that just, if we're just measuring power in a quasi tactical way, and when we have super defined ones, then we sort of lose track of what we can do there. And I know that right now we're sort of in an era when PBTA is getting a lot of pushback, but I feel like systems like that kind of bring in some really cool stuff in urban fantasy, because you're frequently dealing with people who aren't balanced in power, in sort of those Superman versus Batman terms, but they are balanced in like they're all protagonists who are important to the plot.
Yeah, that is one of the things that I've been playing 44 years. When I discovered Powered by the Apocalypse games, it was just like, oh yeah, why haven't we been doing this all along? Because it takes away the mechanics of stats, of that natural progression of I'm going to start here and eventually I'm going to be a god. No, it's a more interesting story. You're a god. What are you going to do with that in a normal setting? You're a vampire in this, or a werewolf. You're now in your normal life. How are you going to, live both? And the Powered by the Apocalypse games just seem to have a lot more flexibility and fluidity to allow you to explore those themes that are very intrinsic to urban fantasy. I mean, like I said, I will always, to the day I die, love World of Darkness, but it just became 5 dots. Everybody's trying to get a discipline, and they forgot, the actual story is you're a vampire, and how do you deal with that?
I'm just going to have to keep agreeing with everyone else here. I think Powered by the Apocalypse works really well for urban fantasy. So the game I'm running at the moment is Monster of the Week, which is heavily inspired by Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And I just think it works really well for that kind of setting. So Liminal, which I've talked about a lot, it's got more of a trad feel to it. You do have skills with numeric values on it, but there is room for interpretation of what those results mean. And the traits that your character can have can often be fairly narrative. And some of them have a specific numeric benefit, but they're sufficiently evocatively designed that you can work around them a bit to get a more interesting story out of them. Also, the magic within it is very heavily based on traditional British witchcraft. So I think that's helping to anchor it in its setting.
I think one of the more, I mean, even Blades in the Dark adds some mechanics that are, and its derivatives adds mechanics that are very intrinsic to the urban fantasy setting of the noir, where it's not a set linear narrative. There is literally a move that going the flashback, that if the players run into an issue, they can say, okay, let's play this flashback. This is actually what happened previously. We've planned for it. We've set this up. And now we can move that, what we did back then into the current play and affect it and basically, get themselves out of a jam or change the narrative itself. I just like the fluidity of that rather than the linear, I'm going to enter this room, I'm going to get this clue, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the, I know there's a right term for it, but like those bargaining type mechanics, like the Devil's Bargain from Blaze in the Dark, where you're like, hey, I'm going to offer this narrative, really sucky thing, but might get that extra die to help you resolve this thing now. And just a great way to add these really like out of left field weird things going on, right? You're being haunted by a ghost now, if you take this extra die. And Powered by the Apocalypse does have kind of that also. It's like the 7 through 9, you get what you want, but you have to sacrifice something. I feel like that for me, I like those bargaining type of mechanics because it does kind of fit the noir feel, right? I'm going to take this bad hit, but I'm going to get what I need to get to my next point. I'm fine sacrificing something personal in order to achieve this and that just feels very detective noir because at the end, detectives either changed or really beat up or demoralized or something, but at least they've achieved their goal. And then you can sit there and feel, was that worth it? It was a satisfying story because you've got this like the player control over how you take the bargain and how you make that kind of deal. I'm very allergic to very like binary pass fail that doesn't give a lot of that like fluidity and that like back. I feel honestly it's the back and forth between a GM and a player going like, well, what if you do this and you get this? That to me is really where the play is. I feel like, in my opinion.
I think to quasi contradict myself, or to say like to move in something that is a slightly more trad friendly or traditional game friendly direction, but still has some cool narrative components to it. I recently got to play Orbital Blues, which is out of the British company Soul Muppet. It's sort of a space western thing, but I think in that space, that sort of the western traditions it's drawing on also fit some stuff that we see in the noir detective, which is that trouble from your past that haunts you into your current action in ways that you're not necessarily expecting. And it's otherwise a pretty straightforward, just action focused game, but then your blues are just sort of showing up everywhere and haunting you, and you look at the situation, you're constantly reminded of troubles from your past, and you're really it brings that out in really cool ways. And I think paranormal investigators specifically would be a really cool system to sort of see a very similar set of mechanics applied to as orbital blues. Something more traditional, because otherwise it's the old traveler mechanic. You're rolling 2d6, you're trying to get an 8. You're adding a stat, you're trying to get an 8. But very, very old, very, very classic mechanic, but then adding that sort of like slightly narrative blues layer onto it, brings out some really cool stuff in the game.
An older game that I always thought added to the urban fantasy, it was more surreal urban fantasy, was Over the Edge, where basically the characters aren't just, I have all the, just these huge stat blocks. The character is a gambler, and that everything, you can roll the dice depending on how that trait would affect the narrative. As a gambler, I can, I might be able to talk to people and, get, basically get them to do what I want. I can cheat. I can do all these different things. And that one trait, gambler, covers it all. And it gives a lot more fluidity than having to have 20 stats, 20 skills.
If there are no more comments on that, then I maybe want to follow up when it comes to specifically mechanics that are used or that you like to use, or maybe that you want to share tips on and techniques that you can use to evoke fear, dread, mystery or wonder, or the horror itself, that are kind of maybe also unique for urban fantasy or for a system that you like.
I mean, I do like that balance in City of Mist between the logos and the mythos, where literally you could be consumed by a concept, or you can completely forget, the magic in itself. I mean, that works perfectly in even a game like Cult Divinity Lost, because that, in kind of many ways, it reflects the old mental balance between light and dark, where you're basically going back and forth, that you see and perceive the world in a completely different way. Your vision goes through the illusion. Are you going to be seeing Metropolis, or are you going to be seeing Inferno? And your connection to those two concepts.
I just talked about it, so I'm gonna, and I think it actually has its roots in keys from John Harper's Lady Blackbird. But I think the blues from Orbital Blues, just that sort of being haunted by a past that precedes your character's current instance, and having to constantly pull on players to sort of bring that past forward. And I think that's one of one of my favorite hardboiled fiction writers is Michael Nava, and he uses flashbacks a ton, but he's always using it to, like, here's this thing I remember from when I was in college or when I was in law school, or this thing that's like 8-9 years in the past that has very little to do with what's going on now, other than like suddenly the main character's brain has gone there. And I feel like that evokes that sort of feel from detective fiction, even though it's not a detective story. It's a space outlaw story. in Orbital Blues, but it's I feel like that evokes that's it's one of the things I see in more fiction and or hardboiled detective fiction that I would love to see in a little more in urban fantasy. Is kind of like that haunting, being haunted by one's own past.
True, Monte?
One mechanic I particularly like in Monster of the Week is one of the moves is called Kick Some Ass. And you use that when you're going directly into combat with a monster. And it, basically, whenever you do it, you're going to get hurt. It's inevitable. It's not, even on a full success, you have one of the options you can do is to take less harm, but it's -1 harm, and if the monster's dealing 3 harm, you're still getting hurt. I think it really emphasizes monsters are dangerous. Fighting them up close is going to hurt.
I can't believe I forgot this game RPG until the very last minute here, but it's literally called Norlandia. The whole point of the game is that you actually get a cork board, and you're trying to solve a mystery, but the game is more like a build a mystery that you eventually solve. And after every scene, you roll based on that scene to like add a new person, place, or thing to this cork board. And that roll determines whether or not you're able to connect like a person or place or thing to each other. And you're literally adding like red lines to create this like giant like conspiracy map. Hopefully can make enough connections so then you can like have a final scene to solve this mystery and confront, the final antagonist kind of thing. But like it's a game that literally builds a relationship map, and so you're building your city that you're in, and suddenly discovering how everything is interconnected. And what's even funnier is that your own characters can become a person, place, or well, not place. Oh, I mean, okay, you can add actually fantasy elements to make it so maybe places can be people, but you can also actually become a suspect that other players can connect you to the actual murderer and kind of thing. But at the end of the game, you have this really complicated conspiracy board, but you've actually built a city with all this history that like this happened and this thing was destroyed because of these occurrences. And like I'm a big fan of those kinds of relationship maps, and I feel like fantasy kind of really needs that, because you're not just relationship with characters, but to the locations and to the history of the city. So I think that's a game that people should check out.
I think one mechanic that can actually be, adapted to urban fantasy is, from all things, the hard science fiction game Traveler. Connections, where basically, if you hit a point, you can say where you don't have a skill or you don't have the ability to progress, you can say, my connection with so and so has basically allowed me to learn this or give me this ability. And then as the GM, you say, okay, describe that scene. How does it? And you kind of do like a flashback scene where you explore that interconnection and that learning process. And it helps flesh out the background of the characters and the world itself. And you can really take that very simple concept and expand it into urban fantasy. And again, weaving it with that flashback concept from Blades of the Dark. It's just basically, you can build the world as you go. And the more you do that, the more agency you give to the players, because they're literally contributing to the story and to the city. So they're connecting themselves to it and to each other.
Fantastic. Unfortunately, as I look on my watch, we are running short on time here. But I want to say thank you very much for this fascinating and interesting panel of urban fantasy. Thank you for all the viewers. But as a final kind of go around, I would like to ask you to kind of plug and share maybe who you are again and what you do, and maybe also like an urban fantasy, urban mystery that you like to play and why. And with that, we kind of end the final round here. This time, let's start with Jason.
I am Jason Fryer. You can find me at Otter Poet on the interwebs. Writer of Cult Divinity Lost, Through the Breach, and other games. If I wanted to, I guess one of my current urban fantasy fascinations is an older game called Kuru, Kuro, basically set in futuristic Japan that is now inundated with yokai and has been completely sealed off. So it's like cyberpunk urban fantasy.
Fantastic. Monte.
Well, I'm Monte Lin. You can find my contact information on my website at monte-lin.com. I am open for editing work if anybody needs like some help with your TTRPG project. Again, you can find me on that on my website. I feel like I'm being very one note. I would love to run a campaign of Witch Fated Souls. I've only been able to run one shots, to promote the game. I do find it maybe a little addicting to be literally the devil in somebody's ear and trying to tempt them to do something really bad is not for their best interest. And weirdly surprised when people say, "Hey, that's a great idea." And so maybe I shouldn't have this power. Maybe I shouldn't be running this campaign. Anyway, that's where I am.
Fantastic. Sue.
I'm Sue Savage. You can find me on the internet under the name Savage Spiel. So you can find me there as on that name on Blue Sky and on Blogspot. And you can find my liminal scenarios on DriveThruRPG. Search for the Liminal Casebook, and naturally that is the game I'm going to recommend. If you like games about paranormal detectives solving weird crimes, it's my absolute favorite.
Fantastic. And Richard.
Hey, I'm Richard Ruane. I am the publisher and writer for Moonlight on Roseville Beach and the upcoming Haunting of Cliff Cove. And definitely, I think the urban fantasy game I want to get back to playing, and I've not played in a long enough time, even though I got to do a one-shot of it only 6 months ago, and still not even played it enough, is one that sort of came on the scene real quick and disappeared. Philip Wessel's Pack of Strays, which is a sort of modern urban werewolf game. Based on Layers and Feelings, but with some really cool mechanical additions there that sort of bring out the power of the loss of control without necessarily needing to re-traumatize players by putting everything in the GM's hands right away. So some really cool stuff there.
Fantastic. And yeah, with that, my name is David. I was the guiding moderator today and throughout that weekend mostly, but helping out at a weekend with good friends. And if I'm not here, then you can find me at the illusionhorrorcon.events, which is a annual convention about horror and anything related to horror gaming and panel discussions, similar to Good Friends, but a little smaller. We're still growing. As well as VassenCon, which is focusing on the Nordic horror role-playing game Vassen by Free League as well, which will be in September this year from 6 to 8, I just realized. And Illusion HorrorCon will be from 6 to 8 December. So if you want to find out more, go to illusionhorrorcon.events or vassencon.com. And you can find me under BitBookChef on probably also a lot of servers on Discord. And I'm very tedious with social, so I'm just saying find me on Discord or through our websites. And with that, I want to thank everyone of my panelists, of all the panelists that we had here at A Weekend with Good Friends. It was fantastic. Thanks to my invisible in the background hiding momentarily co-organizer Miranda. Thank you very much. And with that, I want to say goodbye from us at A Weekend with Good Friends and hope to see you soon again.